It is really and truly my pleasure to have Toby Craig Jones with us today. I have to say that Toby's Desert Kingdom was way ahead of all of the rest of us working on the Gulf in approaching the question of environment, water in particular, long before any of us had ever thought about that. And I have to also say that Toby has proven prescient in more ways than one, and the research that he has done over the years has been a total inspiration. And so for me, it's really super exciting to have him work on a subject that I heard about him, heard him talk about this a long while back. And so he's now doing this research. Toby, as you know, the format is for you to tell us a little bit about how you came to talking about Saudi Arabia, where your first book is about, and your attachments to environment, because I think that has been a very long-standing passion of yours. And I'm incredibly happy to have you here with us. So I'll hand on to you.
Thank you, Lily. I mean, that's very kind. I don't think any of it's true, but I'm grateful to hear it anyway. I mean, I couldn't even spell my name right in the Zoom title, right? I said type. I don't know how we could take me seriously at this point. It's good to see friends here. I know we've got some fellow colleagues from Rutgers here on a group call. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to take the invitation to situate what I really want to talk to everybody about substantively seriously. I mean, I've been at studying the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf, for quite a long time, and a lot of it was by accident. I went to graduate school to do Palestine stuff, and that didn't work out for various reasons. And then a very friendly exchange with Roger Owen at the tail end of my coursework. If you were going to write a study of oil, where would you go to do it? And he encouraged me to think about Saudi Arabia, and I got quite lucky to get access to the kingdom when I did in the aftermath of 9/11, when they weren't letting people come in. And I think I was the first graduate student from the United States ever to get a Fulbright Hays to go to Saudi Arabia. They were not giving those out. So that was 2003. And Desert Kingdom was sort of a happy accident there. I went to Saudi Arabia to do a project at the time that in many ways has become sort of central to how I think about the world and how I think about politics and political economy and why we should study them. And that was to do sort of a social history of an oil pipeline, the Trans-Arabian pipeline that ran from eastern Saudi Arabia to southern Lebanon. But that wasn't possible because of the start of the Iraq War. I was generously hosted by an outfit in Riyadh that didn't have any idea what to do with me. And fortunately, that small institution had an unorganized, non-cataloged library where I literally stumbled over materials that would become the empirical core of the dissertation that would ultimately become Desert Kingdom, which would take me from Riyadh to the Eastern Province to Bahrain and back again over the course of 5 or 6 years. The idea to work on water was also a bit of a happy accident. I wanted to be a historian of oil, and I wanted to understand oil politics in ways that I think that early generation, that sort of early 21st century generation of young scholars, and I put myself in this group. I'm Stefan Hertog, me, more senior, Tim Mitchell, Bob Vitalis, and others who were not persuaded or didn't find sufficient necessarily the old rentier approach to thinking about oil economies and oil politics and wanted a more robust, complicated way of approaching them. And so water seemed like an intriguing way in. And so Desert Kingdom grew out of all of that, as did a kind of long-term fascination with infrastructure, technopolitics, systems, to be able to talk about political order, political transition, political contest, and political struggle, while oil both hovers in the background and is central to the remaking of the physical, social, cultural world, was sort of central to my early making as a historian of the Gulf in the Arabian Peninsula. To situate the current project in that context, it's important to know, and so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories today. I'm going to make a couple of arguments and really sort of outline what I think are the central questions in the book that I'm writing over the next year or so. In 2002, I had finished coursework By 2001, I had finished coursework at Stanford, taken my exams in the spring. Sandy, my partner, and I got married that June. And 4 days later, we moved to Cairo. We both started the CASA program, a year-long intensive language program in Cairo. And it was from Cairo that we watched both 9/11 happen, as well as the American invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, as well as in the spring of 2002, Israel's siege on Ramallah and its attack on the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and a lot that would come from all of that. Returned home in the summer of 2002 with the presidential campaign in full, sort of having been resolved. President Bush was in power. And it was during that moment that the drumbeat for war on Iraq had begun. Iraq as a potential sort of central place from which allegations were being made about al-Qaeda having a presence, maybe having abetted the attacks on 9/11. All of the hysteria around al-Qaeda and Islamophobia had, of course, whipped up in a new round of fervor in the early 21st century. And importantly, over the course of the summer of 2002 and into the fall, the drumbeat for war accelerated, with demands being made on Saddam Hussein's regime, as well as kind of new articulation of an American muscular sort of sense about the region and its responsibilities there, complete with claims about weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, so on and so forth. I participated in several large marches in the fall, including in New York and Washington, D.C. in October of 2022 and in December again. And then I departed for Saudi Arabia on New Year's Eve, 2002, arrived on New Year's Day, 2003, just a few months before the war would start. I proceeded to do my dissertation work. The local al-Qaeda branch in Riyadh, and then again in the Eastern Province, became active, and we were under all sorts of pressure. Gwyneth Krulik and her husband and I were there at the same time, sort of negotiating all of that simultaneously together, and with a lot of confusion about what it all meant. But in the fall of 2002 and the early 2003, one of the things that captured my attention, and of course was central to me, was both the impoverished nature of the anti-war movement, its kind of disconnection from longer histories of anti-war politics in the American context, as well as in Western politics more broadly, as well as the kind of facile arrangement that it positioned itself around with respect to how to think about the Iraq War, what it meant, what explained it, what drove it, what were the motives, what were the material conditions, and how we make sense of it. And particularly striking to me at the time, an aspiring historian of oil and the political economy of oil, were, of course, the slogans that have not dissipated in any meaningful way, but we don't see as often anymore because the Iraq War ended in 2012 and the US dismantled its occupation and withdrew. But that was that the Iraq War was a war for oil. Both on the American political right and the American political left, you hear these slogans constantly in the lead up to 2003, as well as over the 9 years of the waging of the war and the American occupation and the handling all of it. From conspiratorial thinking to more serious arguments from people like Michael Clare and others about how resource scarcity was an engine for international conflict, whether it be water or oil. Oil must have sat at the center of the American strategic calculus, or at least in terms of its political economic calculus for why it went into Iraq. But I wasn't persuaded by any of that. I didn't understand the argument politically that we could potentially make, mindful that I was also opposed to the war, and I was skeptical. I believed that oil did have some role to play. But the Iraq War, it turned out, was not an oil grab. It was not a war for the United States, like the British had done earlier in the 20th century, to build a lasting occupation, to develop a material presence, to either keep oil in the ground or to extract oil from the ground, but in which the British previously had controlled oil at the source of its extraction. The United States did not do that. It wasn't interested in that. It did not build an elaborate infrastructure around Iraqi oil resources. And yet it couldn't shake the thinking that oil had to be an important factor. It was a variable that was necessary to struggle with in order to understand why the United States was engaged at all. And so that led to a long-term sort of sense of, what if I wanted to write about this? What would the stories, how would we approach it critically, conceptually, politically, but also with a kind of activist sensibility in mind? How would we write narratives and histories of oil and its relationship to war in the late 20th and early 21st century, if in fact the era of 19th, early 20th century style British imperialism was gone? What would those stories look like? What would the questions be? And how would we approach them? I convinced Harvard University Press over a lunch discussion to give me a contract for a book on America's oil wars. And then I proceeded to begin to write about it and got in a fight with Harvard University Press, broke the contract, walked away from it. This was a little over a decade ago. But I had done some writing, and one of the things that captured my attention was a story that unfolded on July 3rd, 1988. which I wanted to write about as part of a broader history of oil. And what I'm going to give for you really today, more substantively at the core of the comments and the things that I want to put out there in terms of argument, the questions that animate, or at least a framework for how I'm answering those questions about oil and war, I really have turned out to be situated on that morning of July 3rd, 1988, which is both a tragic moment, a gripping narrative, a scandal in many ways, but also emblematic and revealing a kind of opportunity to dig in and peel back layers of complexity that help us explain the moments that led up to it and the moments that followed. I'm not going to belabor this argument over the course of the remarks that I'm going to make today, but I do want to say that historiographically, one of the interventions I believed I made a couple of, back in 2012, 2013, when I first started thinking about all of this. And I don't think this is revolutionary or necessarily radical for this group necessarily, but it's still important to remind people that by 2003, 2005, 2007, we were still thinking of the 2003 war as a particular moment, as having its own logic, internal or otherwise. And one of the things that I believe to be true and needs to be historicized and narrated is that rather we should think the long arc of the American intervention in the Gulf from the middle of the 1980s until 2012, and in the process building a system that I'll describe a little bit below that has endured ever since as part of one long war. That is to say, the story I'll tell about the Iran-Iraq War and American intervention here briefly, as well as the 1991 war, the era of the sanctions regime, the war on Iraq and Iraqi children in particular in the 1990s, as well as the subsequent intervention in the spring of 2003, concluding only formally in 2012, but really lingering after, is really part of a longer arc of a single military conflict and war that's been generative of all kinds of things. So that's one thing I want out there, is that I see in many ways the story I'm telling with this project on the shooting down of Iranian passenger jet in 1988 is really the genesis, a moment to think about beginnings and think about a long arc of conflict, why and how war became generative, how a system of military occupation in the in the Persian Gulf was built, the logics that drove it, and how we might begin to think about it critically and skeptically, and with all the kinds of necessary cynicism of doing serious scholarly and activist-oriented scholarship. So on the morning of July 3rd, 1988, after 2 years of being in the region militarily, a small American naval vessel, a missile frigate by the name of the USS Vincennes, which was designed and built in the late 1970s and early 1980s in order to protect aircraft carrier fleets from multiple inbound Soviet missile threats, had been dispatched to the Persian Gulf in that spring, in May of 1988. It had sailed from California across the Pacific Ocean into the Persian Gulf, where it arrived and immediately began taking up operations to safeguard the transit of oil from the northern Persian Gulf to the southern Persian Gulf to its exit at the Strait of Hormuz. And I'm going to share an image here so you can see what this looked like. So what's depicted here on the screen is an image of something called Operation Earnest Will, which was the largest convoy operation, the largest American organized and driven convoy operation since World War II, which was imagined and arranged to help transport oil from Kuwait and from northern Saudi Arabia through what had become the dangerous waters of the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. By 1986, American policymakers, naval strategists, and others had argued that shepherding Middle Eastern oil through the Strait of Hormuz was necessary. The outcome of conflict between Iran and Iraq, which had begun almost a decade earlier, and by 1986 had spilled over into the waters of the Gulf itself. Iraq had begun in 1986 attacking Iranian shipping. And it's important to know, part of the backstory here is that Iran and Iraq had bogged down on the battlefields of southern Iraq, as well as along the Iranian border. No progress was made militarily. The war had basically entered a phase of stalemate. Saddam's army would subsequently take to using chemical weapons more intensively than it had earlier in the war. And then just a year or so later, it would launch a genocide campaign against Iraq's Kurdish community, basically raising the stakes, horrifying the region, not unproductively so. Certainly the Arab oil producers were enthusiastic about all of this. But by 1986, the war had spilled into the Gulf. Iran and Iraq would subsequently have been targeting one another's oil shipping, as well as other merchant shipping. This would spiral into attacks on Kuwaiti and Saudi Arabia oil resources, as well as on that country's shipping, which would spark a crisis that would eventually compel the Arab states in the region to approach the United States about providing security, military protection for the extraction and distribution of their oil to Asian and European markets in particular. So by the spring of 1988, the United States was operating a large convoy system, moving oil to and from, building systems of transportation, logistics networks on the international waters of the Gulf in order to protect its allies in the region, and ostensibly in order to protect the supply and the flow of oil in a dangerous neighborhood in an embattled moment in the region's history. Now, I want to say here, if I don't come around to saying it again, I'm one of those people who believes oil is not a scarce resource. It suffers actually from a problem of overabundance, not undersupply. And it's worth knowing that oil prices both dropped and oil supplies expanded precisely at the moment when American policymakers said that the entire system was itself under external threat from regional actors. So, what the US was up to is not really protecting oil supplies at all, something else. By the early summer of 1988, oil shipping had become subject to increased Iranian scrutiny, particularly attacks on international shipping as a result of the emboldened and strengthened American presence. Thinking about the long arc of American political logic and particularly its military logic in the region, it's another thing I want to make a comment about is that understanding American claims about security and insecurity, its stated desire to protect the flow of oil must also be understood more carefully and more critically in parallel. And in fact, I would actually elevate the fact that since the late 1970s, the United States had become a more pronounced and specifically anti-Iranian counter-revolutionary force. The United States was not in the conflict just to protect the flow of oil. It was also in the conflict to ensure an Iraqi victory at the expense of Iranian regional ambition or potential hegemony. And that was rooted almost entirely in the logic that following the 1979 collapse of the Iranian Shah and his order, that the United States was committed to a growing counter-revolutionary program in the region. The American president before Ronald Reagan, who oversaw much of this, Jimmy Carter, argued that the real problem was the Soviet threat in the neighborhood after it invaded Afghanistan in late 1979. But the truth was that the entire orchestration and arrangement of the American military presence had very little to do with the Cold War and was almost entirely committed to limiting Iranian movement, expanding Iraqi movement, and ensuring the flow of Arab oil otherwise. American empire, I want to argue here, is rooted in the logic of counter-revolution, much as it had been earlier in the 20th century in Iraq and Palestine, in Syria and Lebanon, and in other parts of the Persian Gulf, following the radical 1970s and what would follow. So in this way, what I'm arguing is not something new being imagined. The political logic was steady and constant from the 1940s and the 1950s, much as Brandon Wolfe Honeycutt has written about Iraq and elsewhere. The United States has a set of political economic interests that it expresses, and a set of ideological anxieties that also drives those forward, and those ideological anxieties are the threats they argue that revolutionary politics poses to them. So by the early summer of 1988, all of this was unfolding dramatically against the backdrop of an increased and expanded, intensified American military presence, as well as this sort of contentious, what soon to be concluding Iraq-Iran conflict. On July 3rd, the USS Vincennes had engaged in a surface battle on the Gulf, had misidentified in the context of doing so an Iranian passenger jet that took off from Bandar Abbas airport that morning on what was supposed to be a normal routine flight from southwestern Iran to Dubai. And the USS Vincennes, under the leadership of a guy, you can't make this up, under the leadership of a captain named William Rogers. I mean, the classic sort of cowboy. I mean, you couldn't come up with a more cowboy name for an American naval officer operating a high-tech missile cruiser and not knowing how to operate his technology in the late 1980s. Under the captain of William Rogers, the crew misidentified the passenger jet as an Iranian fighter jet. In spite of the radar showing that the plane was ascending, decided that it was actually descending as if to engage in an attack run, turned the missile key, fired 2 Raytheon-produced surface-to-air missiles, and brought down the passenger jet, killing all 300 Iranian civilians and crew on board. Actually, it was an international flight with Pakistanis and some Emiratis on board as well. The story of the shooting down of Flight 655 opened up a pathway to think about some of these questions of American military posture, American empire making, and how to think about the politics and the motives and the drivers of American interests in the region. Of course, the story itself is scandalous. It's heartbreaking and it's wretched. What it's not is a tragedy. While the episode, of course, resulted in the tragic loss of life, in the aftermath, the US government, led by the Pentagon, engaged in a narrative sort of argument, a deliberate cover up to call the accident a tragedy and to frame it in terms that rendered it not responsible. The fog of war, deep confusion, the passenger jet shouldn't have flown into combat or hostile operations, that it was all a terrible mistake. I seized upon the idea of tragedy as a productive thing to sort of scrutinize, but more importantly, as a political point of departure for thinking about, well, if I don't think it's a tragedy and I think something else is going on here, what is the story that needs to be told that helps explain and situate the shooting down of Flight 655 in a longer history? And here I'll get to it. And I'll offer you up a few sort of points that I want you to take away from this brief talk and that hopefully the book will sort of flesh out in greater detail. One is that we need to think anew about both the logics and how we theorize the nature of American empire in the Middle East. While it has a longstanding commitment to regional politics through diplomacy, has longstanding political economic interests bound up with oil, and it has, of course, played a strategic role since 1967 in shoring up Israel and building a close relationship with its surrogate and client state in the region. The reality is by the 1980s, in the vacuum of the British departure a decade earlier, the United States would develop and build a permanent security architecture, military infrastructure that would both militarize the waters of the Persian Gulf as well as all of the energy that moved through it from the late 20th century. And if we think about American empire in this way, we can think in provocative, maybe productive and generative new ways about what we mean by empire at the end of the 20th and early 21st century. We don't have to peddle in the uncertainty of hegemony or theories around it. What the Americans were engaged in was in the building of a 19th century style British naval waterborne imperial presence to control the flow of globally important commodities through the construction and development of an elaborate infrastructure network that it called a logistics system in order to accomplish what on the surface appeared to be market-oriented or to address market-oriented anxieties, which in reality were a cover for driving ideological and other generative, including economic growth issues that emerged in the 1980s. So partly the story of 655 pulls it allows us to unpeel the onion of how we might think critically, historically, and conceptually about the very nature of American empire in the Gulf. One way to get there, I argue, is that in the process of building an infrastructure in the region, I'll go back to this first image that I showed, this map of the convoy system, and say that the second thing that I want to come out of this is to understand that this system in which all of these little points represent kind of either aircraft carrier fleets or military infrastructure come to serve as not just the positioning of American military hardware. And I think, Molly, you've probably read versions of this before in the South Atlantic Quarterly piece, and you've heard me talk about it elsewhere. But I think it's one of the real critical arguments that I want to make here. And it speaks back to that 2002 uncertainty about what does it mean to fight wars for oil. Rather than see war for oil or oil for war as in a kind of dialectic with one another or as parts of a binary in which tensions or actions are sort of projected from one side to the other, I make the argument in developing this sort of conceptual approach to thinking about infrastructure in space to say that in the process of building a militarized order in the region, and specifically through the distribution of American military hardware to shepherd supertankers and other oil infrastructure in and out of the region, that what actually happens by the end of the 1980s is the collapse of the distinction between oil and war. That both in terms of systems, in terms of objects, in terms of their relative value, which I'll develop more in just a moment, that oil and war essentially come to constitute a single order, an militarized energy system in the Persian Gulf, through which both the means and the measures and the value of war pass, not just in value relationship to oil, but in material relationship to oil. oil tankers are militarized objects, and American ships are energy objects, and they need to be understood in relationship to one another. And this is all amassed and assembled in the context of the closing stages of the Iran-Iraq War. Now, one of the things I want to argue, sort of building on the distinction of oil and war being erased, is that while those of us who take a political economic lens to our approach to the region and violence in particular, as well as histories of war, we have comfortably sat, or we've scrutinized, I think productively and importantly, things like weapons sales, or the exchange of oil dollars for weapons systems. And we've approached the question of the region's place in global capitalism and militarized networks of capital generation as weapons sales being particularly important, one of the measures and metrics by which we understand why the United States sees the region, its oil wealth, and how that oil wealth gets recycled as one of the key stories to tell. I don't think that's wrong. In fact, I think it's incredibly important to continue to do that work. But I also want to make an argument that once oil and war are collapsed and supertankers and American naval vessels are brought into direct material relationship with one another, they also begin to take on a value relationship to one another. They need to be seen also as capital, capital in the region, in flux and in transit. And what I mean by that is sort of depicted here. I'll tell you a story that's depicted here on this slide as a way to sort of begin to access it. And I won't belabor this point too much, but I want to raise it here briefly. It can come back up in the discussion. The very first supertanker, the very first convoy that left Kuwait in 1986, there's a whole story of how the supertankers came to be named. They were basically reflagged as American vessels, which according to international law would allow the Navy to protect them as they would any American shipping. But they were Kuwaiti owned and Kuwaiti operated. They just had American names as a kind of loophole in American naval law. The very first convoy had a supertanker named the USS Bridgeton. And on its passage out of Kuwait towards the Southern Gulf, the Bridgeton hit a mine north of Bahrain. Because of the development and building of the Bridgeton itself, supertankers have double hull technology, and so weren't really vulnerable to mine strikes. They weren't going to end up on the bottom of the Gulf. Nevertheless, listed into Bahrain where it was repaired and then sent back on its way. But what it generated was a question amongst American security policy people and naval officers who were developing tactical approaches to negotiating what was becoming an increasingly mined and hostile Persian Gulf, was how to deal with the risk that mining operations presented. They argued and understood that mining wasn't necessarily the same risk to supertankers as it was to the naval vessels themselves. And for a brief moment after the Bridgeton strike, at least, the Navy inverted the order of operations of each convoy. Each convoy saw for a little while, until anti-mining operations could intensify, a complete reordering of the convoy system, which to me is spectacularly interesting and indicative of a broader discussion to have about how systems and values within them need to be scrutinized and thought about. And that is that the supertankers actually ended up taking lead positions and trailing positions within the convoys, not in order to ensure their own passage and transit through the system, but rather to ensure that the American destroyers and frigates and other naval operations wouldn't themselves strike mines. They were much less durable or likely to survive a similar strike that the Bridgeton had. And one American congressperson I remember I read about and had written about, I can't remember who it was exactly, remarked in a congressional hearing afterwards that it would have been horrifying and awakening for the American public, for the American Navy and the American government to wake up to the news that an American cruiser or destroyer had sunk to the bottom of the Gulf because it had struck a mine. Part of what's going on here, I argue, is not only a tactical problem of negotiating the practical realities of thinking about the Gulf, it of course was that. How do you safely transit from north to south? But also an emerging kind of discussion about the very place of war systems and war machines, not just their sale to recapture petrodollars, but rather the central place of a permanent war capacity, and more or less embracing a permanent war footing was generative and productive. Think about Ronald Reagan's arguments in the 1980s with relation to the end of the evil empire and the end of the Cold War, that war was a critical node, and the American defense industry was a critical center in the recovery of the American economy coming out of the difficult decade of the 1970s. And he made high military spending, a deep commitment to not only maintaining a strong military, quote unquote, but spending billions of dollars annually, starting an era that we're still in which defense budgeting and spending occupies a massive place in our national budget. This is really a kind of legacy of the 1980s. Seen in that way, then, what's going on in the Gulf is not just a laboratory for war fighting or a place to experiment with new systems, but rather put on full display that in the process of protecting the vital and instrumental global commodity of the late 20th century, it was also the machines themselves, and not just the machines in the Gulf, but the machines and the sites of their production and the labor that went into building them that was increasingly important to thinking about both the American economy and American power in the world. Places like Newport News, Virginia, Biloxi, Mississippi, ports in California and elsewhere, where both ship production and shipping become central to not only the American economy that's importing and increasingly globalized, but also to the manufacturing and exporting of weapon systems themselves. What that required, I argued that. So then in arguing this, I want to argue that American capitalism is, of course, not just bound up with new increasing forms of production, and that war systems are important because they can fetch a return on investment that's greater than a Ford F-150 can, but rather that war itself becomes instrumental and central to an American imagination about how its economy is supposed to work. And the place where the Americans were most fully at war was in the Persian Gulf, which means that the Gulf is not just a place out there or a strategic interest that's central to an American anxiety about the world or the projection of its power or the protection of the flow of a commodity. Rather, the Middle East needs to be understood as also sitting in the heartland of American sites of production. Much like British imperial historians have argued that the metropole is not just a place outside of empire, but rather we need to understand how the empire functions at the center of power. The same is true for the United States. Culturally, politically, economically, in terms of commodities, and in terms of how war as capital becomes globalized in the late 20th century at the heart and at the core of American empire and power. What this requires rhetorically is something that won't come as a surprise to anybody here, I don't imagine, and that it has to sit both material and discursively in a landscape in which our way of talking about the Middle East in particular, but the global South and its late post-colonial moment more particularly, is both in terms of the very nature of the place, as well as the way that we make sense around it, are constantly places under threat and in danger. As Jimmy Carter's national security advisor argued in the late 1970s, that would really be the precursor for all of this, that the Gulf sits in a place in the northern Indian Ocean and along the eastern shores of Africa that is at the heart of an arc of crisis that requires an American way of acting and behaving in the world. But more particularly with respect to how we think about the Gulf and American military and energy systems that operate upon it. Once the Persian Gulf becomes legible as part of an arc of crisis, and the place is home to rogue actors that could dangerously imperil what gets called the regional balance of power, what American architects of the security architecture are really arguing is that it's the system itself of energy and war transit that's in danger and under threat, and it needs to be protected. So all of the nonsense that would follow 1988, that Iraq and Saddam Hussein is a rogue actor, or that Iran is a rogue state, or that the US seeks to balance forces between its friends and allies in the region and those who are enemies to it, is, in my view, a lot of, I won't use the word I really want to use because I'll be polite, but it's really just kind of magical thinking or a sort of discursive sleight of hand that steers attention away from the thing that's really valued is the operation of an energy military system at the heart of the waters of the Gulf that has to be protected at all costs. What happens in all of this, and I'll end with 2 points. What happens in all of this then, and this is at the core of why Flight 655 would be identified as a target and why a captain operating in the waters of the Persian Gulf of a system designed to protect aircraft carriers would target a passenger jet, is that as this system takes shape from 1986 to 1988 and will become permanently in place as part of a permanent naval strategy going forward from 1991 until today, known as the permanent afloat strategy in the Persian Gulf, which is naval doctrine in the region, is that this waterborne militarized energy system in which oil and energy are inseparable and built into one another, is that sovereignty itself is eroded and erased and challenged constantly. Where we might normally think of the international waters of the Gulf, the boundaries of Iran or the boundaries of Saudi Arabia, and energy being the sovereign objects that move from one place to another through systems of international shipping, by building an architecture of empire and military presence in the Gulf, what the United States do is it actually fundamentally alters the rules of sovereignty in the Persian Gulf to privilege and elevate its own position. And what I want to argue is a kind of post-sovereign posture in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East more particularly. What becomes sovereign instead is not the territorial waters of Iran and Iraq or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, although the United States will nominally pay attention to all of that. What becomes sovereign instead are all the little nodes in the system that move around, particularly the American nodes in the system. Ships, tankers, floating infrastructure, floating oil derricks, other infrastructure and operations come to have attached to them a kind of literal floating sovereignty in which each object comes to occupy a three-dimensional quality that floats around on the Persian Gulf, that both above water, below water, and in a circuit around it, think of little orbs constantly sort of transiting and taking up positions in the Persian Gulf, are bound up with international rules of sovereignty, particularly of power. And so in this way, the United States, I'm going to go back to the slide, the first slide that I showed you. The United States builds an order in which the logic of the order can basically be boiled down to an argument that it is filling the Gulf with its own objects in order to deterritorialize sovereignty from neighboring states and situate it within the objects that the United States is moving around. I mean, I think this is very much a 19th century British approach to its own imperial navy and its imperial transits. The United States is not inventing a new way of thinking. But it's not something we pay enough attention to in the late 20th or early 21st century to think about, mostly because our view and our gaze is diverted to what we're told are bad actors on land and in terrestrial spaces. I want to end with this point. This is all hiding in plain sight. I don't actually think there's anything radically or remarkably new or insightful in any of this. Naval logistics officers, I mean, Lolly can tell you that shipping captains, moving around from the northern Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf are constantly thinking about transit and logistical problems and adopting apolitical positions that buries or situates the challenges they face in language of technopolitics that's basically makes it a managerial problem rather than something else. This has been going on in the Gulf for now close to 40 years. It's not new and it's not remarkable. What's interesting about it is that it's almost invisible. And this brings us back to Flight 655. Part of the problem that Captain Rogers would say afterward, because he was equipped with a new technological system to identify threats, is that he had, in the fog of war, had been incapable of reading the data in a way that should have been more legible or easier. He suffered from, he claimed, his own crisis of visibility, that the radar and the other technological systems in operation and on display had made it difficult to sort through the fog of war and the combat environment to appropriately diagnose the absence of a threat rather than the presence of a threat. But the politics of visibility and the reality of visibility and invisibility is a broader problem, and that because the Gulf is thousands of miles away, and even if we make the argument that the systems of operation that build the very machines that end up circulating and moving there, and hundreds of thousands of jobs are bound up with them, we nevertheless are unable to scrutinize and look closely at the nature of infrastructural systems or material practices in which American power is bound up. And so when things go wrong, we render them an accident. Or when things seem threatened, we fall back on familiar lines of thinking about territorial threats or individual actors. We personalize the nature of stories, whether it's the case of Saddam Hussein or somebody else, right? Now, to be fair, some of this is a product of the sleight of hand and the nature of political discourse. Power lies constantly about what its true ambitions and actions are meant to serve. But the problem of visibility is also one that's a convenience for those of us that sit outside of it. And this is perhaps where I have sort of my least confident footing. I'm not quite sure what to say here. I'm sort of thinking about it. But we don't have to reckon with it because we can't see it. Out of sight, out of mind is partly true. How to then transform what we can learn from all of this into a mode of action, and in particular into a viable anti-war movement that can diagnose the problem carefully and with some specificity, but also make it compelling to people who not only can't see it, but who can't be bothered to look, is an enduring challenge and something that I haven't necessarily reckoned with in this project. Maybe I will in an epilogue if I have an epiphany, or maybe you guys will help lead me to it. Anyway, I'll stop there. And I think I'm right on time.
That was absolutely amazing. So I'm going to go on ahead and stop the recording. And then